The storm rolled across the plains like a living thing, thunder dragging its knuckles through the sky as rain slashed down on the lonely stretch of land where Elijah Crow lived and worked alone, a giant of a man in both size and silence, his ranch spreading wide and empty as the ache he carried in his chest, an ache that had settled there years ago after the graves were filled and the house went quiet, and tonight he should have been inside, fire burning, supper cooling on the table, but something pulled him toward the barn, a strange sense that the storm wasn't the only thing trespassing on his land, and when he pushed open the heavy wooden door, the lantern light caught movement where there should have been none, a small shape pressed between hay bales, shaking, soaked, and breathing like a frightened animal cornered by the world. And Elijah froze, every instinct trained by years of hard living telling him danger came in many forms, not all of them armed. And then she lifted her face, mud-streaked, eyes too old for her age, fear sitting in them like it had learned the shape of her soul, and she whispered, barely louder than the rain, "Please, don't tell them I'm here." And something inside the giant cowboy cracked, because no one who spoke like that had ever been protected by the world. She was thin, bone-sharp under her soaked dress, hair cut uneven as if done in the dark with shaking hands, and she smelled of rain, fear, and long roads walked without looking back. And Elijah didn't ask her name at first, didn't demand answers, because the way she flinched when he stepped closer told him questions had never been kind to her. So instead he took off his coat, big and worn and smelling of leather and smoke, and draped it over her shoulders, his hands careful, slow, like he was handling something already broken. And she stiffened but didn't pull away, which told him more than words ever could. And when he said, "You're safe, ain't nobody hurting you here," his voice came out rough, unused, like a gate that hadn't been opened in years. Her knees buckled then, the fear finally releasing its grip, and Elijah caught her without thinking, her weight light in his arms, too light for someone who looked nearly grown, and she clung to his shirt like the storm itself was trying to steal her back, whispering over and over, "They'll find me. They always find me." And that's when he heard it, the distant sound of horses, voices carried on the wind, sharp and searching. And Elijah knew in his bones this wasn't a simple runaway story. This was trouble with teeth, and whatever she was running from didn't plan on giving up. He moved fast then, giant steps echoing in the barn as he guided her deeper inside, hiding her behind stacked crates and feed sacks, telling her to stay silent no matter what she heard. And when she looked up at him with panic flaring again, he crouched so their eyes were level and said something he hadn't planned, something that rose up from a place older than fear. "I won't let them take you." And she nodded, trusting him with the kind of blind hope only the desperate ever have. The riders arrived moments later, 3 men hard-faced and wet with rain, their eyes scanning the land like it owed them something. And when they asked Elijah if he'd seen a girl pass through, their words were polite, but their hands stayed close to their guns. And Elijah felt the choice settle on his shoulders like a yoke, heavy and final, because if he said no and they searched anyway, she'd be found, and if he said yes, he'd be handing her back to whatever hell she'd escaped. So he did the only thing that made sense in a world that had taken enough from him. Already he lied calmly, steadily, telling them no one came through his land without him knowing, that the storm must be confusing their tracks. And when one of the men sneered and said, "Mind if we take a look around?" Elijah straightened to his full height, a mountain rising in the rain, and said, "This is private land." Tension stretched thin as wire, lightning flashing behind Elijah like the sky itself had chosen a side, and for a moment he thought it would end in blood. But something in his eyes, or maybe the way his hand rested easy at his side, made the men reconsider, and after a long beat they turned away, promising they'd be back, their threat hanging in the rain long after they disappeared into the dark. And only then did Elijah breathe again, his heart pounding not from fear for himself, but from the knowledge that he'd just stepped into a war he couldn't walk away from. When he returned to the barn, she was still there, arms wrapped around herself, eyes wide, and when he told her they were gone for now, she sagged like a string cut loose, whispering thank you through tears she clearly hated showing. And that's when he asked her name, and she said it softly, like it might be taken from her if spoken too loud. "Clara," and he repeated it once, anchoring it in the air between them, and offered her food, dry clothes, a place to sleep in the loft where no one would look twice, and she accepted each thing like a gift she didn't believe she deserved. Later that night, as the storm faded and silence returned, Elijah sat alone at his table, staring at the empty chair across from him, thinking about the promise he'd made without meaning to, knowing those men would come back, knowing the world didn't forgive kindness easily, and when Clara crept down the stairs hours later, unable to sleep, asking in a voice barely above a whisper what would happen if they returned, Elijah looked at her, really looked, and something fierce and protective settled into place, and he said the words that would change both their lives forever. If they ask, "You're my wife now." Her eyes flew wide, shock and confusion battling fear. But before she could protest, he added, gentler, steadier, "A married woman on my land ain't theirs to take. Folks respect that. And am respected too." And the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of possibility, danger, and the fragile beginning of something neither of them had been looking for but both of them desperately needed. And out there in the dark beyond the fences and the fields, the past was already turning. Back toward them, morning came slow and gray over the ranch, the kind of dawn that carried more questions than answers, and Elijah was already awake when the sun finally clawed its way over the hills, sitting at the table with a cup of cold coffee, staring at nothing while the weight of the lie he'd told settled deeper into his bones. Because calling Clara his wife hadn't been a trick, meant only for strangers. It was a promise that demanded protection, consistency, and sacrifice. And when she came down the stairs wrapped in one of his old shirts, sleeves too long, eyes cautious but softer than the night before, something shifted between them, unspoken yet powerful, like two people standing at the edge of the same cliff, unsure who would jump first. He explained quietly what being his wife would mean to the outside world, how she'd have to stand beside him, answer questions, look unafraid even when she wasn't. And Clara listened, nodding, her fingers clenched tight in the fabric, until she finally said, "I've pretended my whole life." And there was no bitterness in her voice, only exhaustion. And Elijah realized then that whatever she was running from had stolen her childhood long before it stole her freedom. The men came back just before noon, dust rising behind their horses like a warning. And this time they didn't bother with politeness, their eyes sharp, scanning every corner of the ranch as if searching for a crack in the story. And when Elijah stepped out onto the porch with Clara at his side, his massive frame steady, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm like it belonged there, the air changed, suspicion flickering across their faces as they took in the sight of her standing tall instead of hiding. And when one of them sneered and asked who she was, Elijah didn't hesitate, his voice calm and iron hard. "My wife." And Clara felt the word land heavy and strange in her chest. But she lifted her chin just like he'd told her to, meeting their gazes without flinching. And for the first time in her life, someone stood between her and the threat instead of stepping aside. The men pushed, asking questions meant to unravel lies, but Elijah answered everyone without faltering, talking about marriage dates, shared meals, future plans, his hand firm on Clara's back, grounding her when memories threatened to pull her under. And when one of them grabbed her wrist suddenly, testing, Elijah moved faster than anyone expected, his grip crushing, his voice low and lethal as he warned them never to touch his wife again, and the silence that followed was thick enough to choke on, the balance tipping as the men realized this wasn't a lonely rancher they could intimidate. It was a man with something to lose, and that made him dangerous. They left again, but this time the threat wasn't spoken. It lingered in their eyes, promising that lies had a price. And as the dust settled, Clara's knees gave out, the strength draining from her all at once, and Elijah caught her, holding her while she shook, whispering that she did good, that she was safe, words she'd never heard said with such certainty before. Days passed, then weeks, and the lie began to blur at the edges, turning into something dangerously close to truth. As Clara learned the rhythms of ranch life, cooking meals with Elijah, mending clothes, laughing softly at his rare, awkward jokes, and Elijah found himself listening for her footsteps, noticing the way the house felt warmer, fuller, less haunted. And when she finally told him the truth, how she'd been sold, how she'd escaped men who saw her as property instead of human, Elijah didn't speak for a long time, only stood and pulled her into his arms, holding her like he could shield her from every memory, every nightmare. And she cried then, not from fear but from relief, because someone finally believed her without asking for proof. The reckoning came on a night thick with stars, when the men returned one last time with papers and threats and the law, twisted in their favor, demanding Clara be handed over. And Elijah made his choice without hesitation, tearing the papers apart and standing firm, telling them they'd have to go through him first. And this time Clara didn't hide behind him. She stepped forward, voice shaking but strong, telling them she was done running, done being owned, and when the standoff ended with the men retreating for good, the danger finally lifting, the quiet that followed felt sacred, earned with bloodless bravery and truth spoken out loud. Later, as they stood in the doorway watching the night settle over the land, Clara asked the question they'd both been avoiding, asking what happened now that the lie had served its purpose. And Elijah looked down at her, his giant hands gentle as he brushed a strand of hair from her face, admitting that somewhere along the way, the pretending had stopped, that calling her his wife had become the truest thing he'd said in years. And when she smiled soft, real, unafraid, and said she felt the same, the loneliness that had defined both their lives finally loosened its grip, replaced by something built not on rescue alone, but on choice, trust, and love freely given. And so the barn that once hid a frightened runaway became the place where a new life quietly began. The weeks that followed should have been quiet, but peace had a way of testing people who'd never been allowed to trust it. And Clara found herself waking in the dark, heart racing, listening for footsteps that weren't there, while Elijah learned that loving someone, even quietly, even carefully, meant standing guard against ghosts no fence could keep out. And though the ranch looked the same under the wide sky, everything felt different, fuller, fragile in a way that mattered, because now there was something to lose. The town took notice soon enough, whispers following them when they rode in together, eyes lingering on how naturally Clara fit at Elijah's side, how the giant cowboy who once spoke to no one now listened like every word mattered. And when questions came, they answered them together. No scripts, no lies rehearsed, just a shared understanding that whatever this had started as, it was real now. Trouble, though, has a long memory. And one afternoon a stranger arrived with a badge and a tone too smooth to be honest, asking about old claims, old debts, old mistakes that had nothing to do with Clara but everything to do with control. And Elijah felt the familiar pull of the past trying to drag him back into solitude and sacrifice. But this time Clara didn't let him face it alone, stepping forward steady and unafraid, telling the man that this land, this life was hers too, and that she wouldn't be traded, taken, or frightened into silence ever again. The confrontation ended not with violence but with something harder, truth spoken, aloud, witnessed, recorded, and when the badge turned away for good, Elijah realized strength didn't always come from size or fists, but from standing still when the world expected you to break. That night, under a sky spilling with stars, Elijah took Clara back to the barn where it had all begun, the scent of hay and rain long gone, replaced by warm wood and quiet memories. And he admitted what he'd never said out loud, that he'd been lonely long before she arrived, that he'd built his life like a fortress because loving once had nearly destroyed him. And Clara listened, fingers laced with his, telling him she wasn't afraid of scars, that hers had taught her how to survive and how to choose. And when he asked her, voice rough, hopeful, real, if she wanted to stay not because she had to, but because she wanted to, her answer came without hesitation, a soft yes that felt louder than any vow. They didn't rush a wedding, didn't need the town's approval or grand words spoken for show, because what they had was built in storms and silence, in protection freely given and freedom fiercely respected. And when Clara finally laughed without flinching, when Elijah slept through the night without listening for loss, the ranch itself seemed to breathe easier, as if the land knew it had been given something back. The barn that once hid a runaway now stood as a reminder that sometimes the safest place isn't where you hide, but where someone stands beside you and says you belong. And as dawn rose over the fields, Clara rested her head against Elijah's chest. Knowing she hadn't been saved, she had been chosen, and in choosing him back, she'd finally found home. Time has a way of revealing what was real all along. And on Elijah Crow's ranch, the seasons turned with a quiet grace that neither of them rushed nor feared anymore, because the fear that once ruled Clara's life had loosened its grip, replaced by routines built on trust, choice, and the steady presence of a man who never raised his voice but always showed up. And the giant cowboy who once lived like a ghost among his own fences now found himself planning ahead, mending not just gates and barns but the long broken pieces of his heart, while Clara learned what it meant to breathe without permission, to sleep without listening for danger, to laugh without apology. The town eventually stopped whispering and started watching with respect as the pretend marriage became something undeniable, not announced with banners or ceremonies, but proven in small moments. The way Elijah always waited for her steps before closing a door, the way Clara touched his arm when he grew quiet, grounding him back to the present. When they finally did marry for real, it wasn't for protection or appearances, but because neither of them wanted to. Imagine a life where the other wasn't there, and the barn where Clara once hid in terror stood open and sunlit, transformed from a place of fear into a symbol of beginning, witnesses being the land itself, and a future neither had dared hope for. Years later, travelers would still speak of the giant cowboy who saved a runaway girl, but those who truly knew the story understood that what happened on that ranch wasn't rescue alone, it was recognition. Two broken lives choosing each other and proving that safety doesn't come from walls or lies, but from standing together when the world comes knocking. Clara never ran again because she no longer needed to, and Elijah never stood alone again, because loneliness had finally met its match. And as the wind moved gently through the grass and the barn doors creaked in the evening light, the life they built together stood as quiet proof that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is stay, and sometimes the strongest man is the one who says, "You belong here." Long after the storms that brought Clara to the barn had faded into memory, the ranch stood as something more than land and fences. It became a refuge, a place where broken things were not hidden but healed. And Clara found herself opening the gates to others who carried the same haunted look she once had, runaways of a different kind, people worn thin by life, and Elijah watched her do it with quiet pride, knowing the girl who once trembled in the hay had grown into a woman who could stand steady in the open sun without fear. They never forgot where they started, never forgot the lie that became a truth. And on evenings when the sky burned gold and the wind whispered through the grass, they would sit on the porch together, hands intertwined, remembering how close everything had come to ending before it truly began. Elijah learned that strength didn't mean standing alone anymore, and Clara learned that love didn't require permission or pain to be real. And together they built a life that spoke louder than any rumor or threat ever had. Years later, children would ask about the old barn, why it was kept so carefully when newer buildings stood stronger, and Clara would smile and say it was where her life began again, while Elijah would simply nod, understanding that some places hold more than wood and nails. They hold promises kept. The ranch became known not for its size or wealth, but for its safety, for the quiet giant who never turned away someone in need, and the woman who proved that survival could turn into purpose. And when travelers passed through, they left lighter than they arrived, carrying stories of kindness that spread farther than fear ever could. And in the end, when the nights grew slower and the stars felt closer, Elijah would look at Clara and know that the greatest thing he ever protected wasn't land or legacy, but a moment of courage that walked into his barn one rainy night and changed everything. Because sometimes a runaway doesn't need saving, she needs someone brave enough to say stay. And sometimes a lonely giant doesn't need strength, he needs someone to give it meaning.